So many people everywhere now. Just because of the spring break, I guess. It's kind of making it a little bit more difficult to find places to find stuff just because there's too many people around you. And the first thing I read today, guess more security issues with sites like Facebook, says Facebook admits it stored hundreds of millions of account passwords in plain text. According to this, it says it was discovered in January after a routine security review, and it says none of the passwords were visible to anyone outside Facebook, he said. Facebook admitted the security lapse months later after Krebs said logs were accessible to some 2,000 engineers and developers. And I guess one of the scary things is said the bug dated back to 2012. So one of those change your passwords and everything like that again if you use the site. I guess that company can't get a break even this year, huh, when it comes to security issues and all that. And with pretty much, I guess, the spring here, I guess you could say, summer's almost here, which will be the implementation of those new drone rules and stuff here in Canada. And it's kind of interesting to read, I guess, the perspectives of people who are for the rules. There was one perspective which was kind of interesting to me, which was along the lines of, it has nothing to do about safety, but essentially it's still good because you need to hold people accountable. I'm like, oh, what an interesting perspective. Because to me, it's always fascinating when drone flyers themselves, in some ways, I guess, support what I feel are over-the-top rules that make absolutely no sense. Because in my perspective, if you're making a law in this sense, it should basically benefit everybody in a fair way, not just a unique group of people, for example. Because from my personal experience, even just from talking to people, it seems like everyone's focused on themselves when they're for it. And for this person, you seem to have replied to a bunch of videos with pretty much the same narrative. Like, for example, here you say, this isn't about safety. This is about accountability on the part of the pilot, and probably to weed out those casual pilots who don't have any desire to jump through the hoops. TC just wants to know who's out there. To me, that's a little confusing, because with the narrative and stuff like that, it should all be about protecting people. If it's not about safety, then why have that narrative of the drone crashing into a plane, incident reports and all that? So that's a little weird, like perspective-wise, in my opinion, if you say it's not about safety and it's in a sense, you know, okay. Now this is kind of an interesting perspective. It says, I think the way they're going about it is questionable, but by making it a pain in the ass on purpose, they're limiting the amount of idiots out there flying potentially damaging drones in the controlled airspace. In my opinion, that is not proper, like the way to make like a regulation, because it would be like me saying, I'm just exaggerating, if I was the transport minister, I wanted to stop car incidents or accidents from happening, I'll just make it such a pain in the ass, the whole process, so to speak, like you say, that there's going to be virtually no drivers on the road. The only people who will be driving are people in the military or government officials, because it's so restrictive and all that. It basically gets rid of anybody using just a car in general just to drive from location to location, not necessarily for work, but just in general. I mean, I must be the most horrible lawmaker in the world if I did that just to stop people from driving, to stop the accidents from happening in general. And just my personal opinion, just making something a quote pain in the ass, making it so out of reach for the majority, is, in a sense, in my opinion, it's lazy governing, I guess you could say, or lazy lawmaking. You don't want to take the time to actually go out, see how everybody is using it nowadays, and then create a plan. Instead, you're like, yeah, just throw something out there. Like, to me, it just seems like it's more like do something for the sake of looking like you're doing something. I always wonder, for people who come up with their thoughts and stuff about the regulations, are you thinking about it just for yourself personally, or are you thinking of it for everybody in general? Because you wrote here in a different one, it says, I get that the test is irrelevant, it will probably change as time goes on, but I don't have a problem with the regulations. As a guy who wants to start doing aerial videography professionally, these rules make it a bit easier to go in the field and shoot for clients. Before these new rules, I'd have to apply for an SFOC for every project, so I don't mind a $10 test and a $5 reg fee. And then you go further on to say, these new rules are not good for the hobbyist, but for the professional who understands the limitations. So from what you wrote there, from what I gather, you are a commercial flyer, and you're saying because it suits your needs, for the most part, it makes sense. It just makes your life so much easier, less paperwork and all that. But again, you have to think of everybody. I mean, just an example, like for me, I fly it recreationally. I use it as a camera just to capture footage. So let's just say, for example, with things like visual line of sight, I could look at it and say, I always can see it. I can see it in the air, I capture it, no issues with me. Makes sense for safety. But then how about those other people who fly things like, say, FPV drones? Let's just say they're just flying something so small in a little area, but technically it's illegal for them to wear like those goggles because they can't see around them anymore, just what's in front of the camera that transmits to the signal. Why is that not okay? I mean, for the most part, they're just toys for a lot of people too, but again, that is illegal, so I have to think of everybody, not just myself. Like there, you would think it would make more sense saying if you're flying it in your own private property or something like that, in those cases, perfectly fine. As long as you don't go over, for example, the tallest object, that's perfectly fine, etc., etc. But you can't have like a blanket thing, and you say it's okay just because it works for you. There's more people than just yourself in terms of these laws that it would affect. And then you left a comment in another different video, which kind of makes me wonder actually if people actually watch the whole video, digest what I'm trying to say before you comment like again, because you're kind of saying the same thing here. You're saying these rules are not about safety. You have to realize this. They are about accountability. A majority of drone flyers are responsible people who just fly for fun. But there have been some close calls in larger centers, and don't fool yourself. A drone can do serious harm to an aircraft. For that point, again, it's all about balance. Is what you're making make sense for everybody in general, not just like sensational examples? Because in my mind, almost everything in life could be used as a weapon, cause something catastrophic, but is that a reason for you to constantly live in fear, for example, and to restrict the use of, like, say, the tech just because of that paranoia? I mean, here's a great example that people always bring up. I mean, if you go back in history, apparently in some places there was something called a red flag traffic law in terms of how people have to operate cars. And just from the Wikipedia, it says, red flag laws were laws that United Kingdom and United States enacted in the late 19th century, requiring drivers of early automobiles to take certain safety precautions, including waving a red flag in front of the vehicle as a warning. And then more specifically, it says, in the United Kingdom, the Locomotive Act was a policy requiring self-propelled vehicles to be led by a pedestrian waving a flag or carrying a lantern to warn bystanders of the vehicle's approach. Now try thinking of like drones in retrospect with this. This is apparently what was written there. Firstly, at least 3 persons shall be employed to drive or conduct such locomotive, and if more than 2 wagons or carriages he attached thereto, an additional person shall be employed who shall take charge of such wagons or carriages. Secondly, 1 such person, while any locomotive is in motion, shall precede such locomotive on foot by not less than 60 yards, and shall carry a red flag constantly displayed, and shall warn the riders and drivers of horses of the approach of such locomotives, and shall signal the driver therefore when it shall be the necessary to stop, and shall assist the horses and carriages drawn by horses passing the same. Can you imagine that nowadays? I mean, if you think about that, you're gonna laugh at it, right? Driving a car like that, having to get out 3 people with a flag and so forth. I mean, think of it in retrospect, like say with a drone, where they're making it such a big deal in many ways in virtually every single situation. Like here, I would say, isn't the point of reading things like history is to learn from it? So you could say, for example, well, they just have to do something, but why be that ridiculous like this? Like when you look back at history, why couldn't you have a more forward thinking of it? I mean, nowadays, cars can come within literally like centimeters of people when they're walking. Like say on the sidewalk, they're on the road. Like how do we manage that? Like if I'm always gonna be below here, why is there ever going to be an airplane literally here, for example, or a helicopter? And this part I'm kind of surprised you actually wrote this. It says, anyways, the drone regs are for the government to keep tabs on people. The rules miss the point and the test is ridiculous, but there does need to be some accountability on the part of the pilot. It's just my opinion, but you should not be creating things just to, quote, keep tab on people with no justifiable reason. Are you telling me in life, with things like cars, you're perfectly okay for a rule or regulation to say, even if you drive your car for personal use, you have to write down every single day exactly where you drove, what you bought today, what you put in the car from the grocery store? Anybody that stepped inside, you're gonna have to document everything as well? What? Come on, you can't tell me anyone would be in agreement with that. There would be an outrage. There's no way people would accept that. Kind of reminds me of a conversation I had with a person where at first he had that attitude as well, saying, Shrug shoulders, you know, people need accountability, they need something. Then as soon as I use something that he uses every day, like the car, saying you'd have to do this, document that, etc., treat it as if you're a business working for the government every single day of your life, that's when he started to think, oh yeah, well maybe it doesn't make sense anymore. I mean, like here, just because it doesn't affect you personally with the way you use it, you have to think of everybody. I would say personally, in terms of accountability, it should be the other way around. Because remember, those people, the government officials or whatever, the lawmakers, they work for the people. They should have a right to know exactly how they came up with something, what their motivation was, who influenced them, etc. Because if it doesn't make sense, like you said, and it misses the mark, and they're doing it, let's just say, for the sake of doing something so people can look at it and say they're doing their job, then in my opinion, that's misleading. They need to be transparent about that, and they need to be held accountable for not taking the time to do stuff that actually benefits everybody. I mean, geez, too, what do you have on the team there? Like a former astronaut and stuff like that? Why is someone like me, just using basic common sense, can think of these stuff that they should have thought of before? Because in my opinion, it just comes down to the fact that the hobby in general is just way too niche. If it was something as crazy or mainstream as, like, say, your smartphone, again, it wouldn't even last a day. Those guys would be fired right away. They'd fear, oh no, we can't do this, let's change it back. There's no way it would be accepted in any form of life with the way it's written like this. About the part with the accountability, I would argue there's already overlapping laws that relate to the drone flyers in that sense. I mean, what's one of the #1 things? Privacy, right? People flying this drone being a peeping Tom, even though it's extremely exaggerated. But if someone was caught using the drone in that way, they could be punished for things like voyeurism. I mean, there's laws that relate to it already. Doesn't matter what you use, the drone camera, a telephoto lens, you will be treated the same way in terms of them trying to prosecute you and seeing what your punishment should be. Or let's just say someone wants to use their drone as a weapon of sort. They just think it's hilarious to run their drone into people and so forth. Again, there's already laws, I would imagine, where if you use the drone in that way, it will be considered as like a weapon. Doesn't matter if someone used a stone and chucked at someone really hard, which knocks them unconscious, uses a car to intentionally run over people, people would treat it on a case-by-case basis. But overall, again, in terms of the accountability, it should be the other way around as well. I mean, if you say, like, these laws, they make absolutely no sense, but they just need to put something out there, then they have to be transparent about that. Or same thing, if the only reason you came up with this law is because you had a quote nightmare scenario, I would actually like a detailed report of what your quote nightmare scenario was, so that I and many other people can evaluate whether or not you're psychologically or mentally prepared to come up with rules for stuff like that. Because your own personal bias or fears in that way shouldn't be the reason you come up with these crazy things, for example. It doesn't make sense. I mean, you need some guidelines and rules, but not in an over-top way that restrict everybody. Because I would imagine in most things in life, if that law in some way is prejudiced or discriminating against a group of people, you wouldn't stand for it. You wouldn't just say, okay, yeah, we just gotta put something out there immediately, or like, get that out of here. Alright, see you guys later.